You do not want to fail your PhD. Am I right? If you're doing a PhD, you did not set out to fail or to leave. And this is a common problem that we all face. And in today's video, I want to talk about 3 things you can try and avoid to prevent that failure. But before we do that, it's a very important question. What light do you think is important? I've got red, it's a bit too dark, orange, blue. I like blue actually. Should we do blue? I had it on this one. Is that one? I'm just looking at I can't be bothered to look that way. I think we'll go with blue. Let me know in the comments which light you think looks best. But let's get back to the actual video at hand, which is how not to fail your PhD. Now, the 3 things I'm going to be going through are advices I got taught, I got advised on, and things that kind of came to my attention further on I went during my PhD. And there were times I wanted to quit, times I wanted to give up because I had enough. And for those who may not know, those who are maybe new to my channel and through my journey, there's a video up here, I'll link in the video card, about my journey through my PhD and why I had reasons to potentially leave, reasons to quit because I had enough. But away from the emotional stress, there are actual things you can do or not do that can lead to you actually failing your PhD. There's a difference between giving up, leaving, and also failing. So being rejected, having major corrections, or being told to have maybe another qualification instead of a PhD. So today's video is going to be looking at 3 things you need to probably have a look at, internalize, and include into your day-to-day habits and behaviors as a research student, so you can minimize failing because of these aspects. And if you're new to the channel, do consider subscribing if you want. You can click the subscribe button and the notification bell so you notify when I upload. But let's get to the first thing you should avoid so you don't quit your PhD. Now, the first one is very important. It's all about academic naivety. Now, the best way to look at it is assume nothing. Assume nothing in the sense of assume you don't know anything, assume people around you may not know anything, assume people may not help you, assume you don't trust anybody, assume nothing. And the reason why I mention this is that there's a lot of collaborations, there's a lot of help, but you don't want to rely on anybody. You don't want to put your PhD in somebody else's hands, or put part of your research or part of your work in somebody else's hands, or that you want to rely on waiting on somebody else to bring in something. Assume nothing and do your best to try and work it out yourself. And as a last resort, you go seek somebody. Now, the reason why I mention this so important is that many times people can fail their PhD because they relied on somebody else's data or relied on somebody else's help without throughputting it, without trying it themselves. And the same with somebody, even your trust, your confidentiality, your novelty. Don't assume that you can trust everybody else. Assume, and again, I know this sounds very old-fashioned, is don't trust anybody and then build your way to trust people as opposed to the other way around within research. The reason why is you want to look after your PhD, you want to look after your data. And there are many times that you will share with people, you will discuss, you will have great relationships, you will have great collaborations. But you don't want to assume that from the get-go. And I've seen many stories and many people who they've trusted other people and their PhD has gone haywire. They've relied on other people's data, not realizing that that data was falsified. There are many other scenarios where you can go into it naive because you're enthusiastic, you enjoy research. It's a great, achievement to get to do a PhD. But don't let that get to your head, even if it's not by purpose. Because you can go through a PhD, gathering data, thinking everything's hunky-dory, that person's gonna help me, that person's gonna help me, and then 6 months later, it falls through because you were hoping on something else. And there's a very fine line between hoping and expecting. Don't expect things to happen. You can hope for people to help. You can hope for people to come through with certain things, but don't expect it to always happen. And I think one of the unfortunate ways some people have got to their viva or they've failed their PhD even before then in like an annual review, it's not always the case, but it does happen. It's because they've relied on somebody else or something else. So assuming nothing and trying to do it themselves. So I hope that makes sense. That you want to grab it by the scruff of the neck and make sure it's yours. Make sure you go through everything. And if you need to, as a last resort, you go seek help and advice and support to bring in data to your research. But don't assume that everybody's going to help. And don't assume people are going to bring stuff for you. Because it's a very dangerous game to be in that realm of somebody else essentially having a responsibility to your PhD. It is yours and yours for a reason. And part of this naivety is with your supervisors and with your colleagues. And I mentioned about not relying on them, but also that trust bit I mentioned about having email threads, having evidence that you did work, having pictures or videos or conversations recorded. So then you know that you got your evidence in your court, if that makes sense. So then if there's an issue or there's a discussion or there's something that's not right, you have a trail of evidence that you can go back to, that you can discuss. Because same people that helped you in your first year may cause a problem in the third year. Your supervisor may be amazing, and rightly so, but then there might be a problem that you then don't have evidence for because you assume that it would be all fine. You see what I mean? So I think make sure you have evidence, make sure you don't assume anything from that point of view. That's why this naivety becomes a big problem the further you go in your PhD. So I would advise big time is evidence, email threads, pictures, videos, conversation recorded, especially emails. And the reason why I'm going back to this is that everything can be discussed in email, the results, ideas, meeting plans, experimental ideas. So then you've got a trail of, you've got a timestamp and you've got a trail of evidence. And believe me, it will help you massively in the long run. Academic naivety, try avoid it by using those, you can say, those kind of guides or those how-tos to prevent you getting in trouble and standing there and say like, I didn't do it. Oh, I don't have evidence. You don't want to be in that position as a PhD student. But let's move on to number 2. Number 2 is all about a lack of organization, and that just refers to not just your experimental designs, not just how you plan your research from day to day, week to week, or even month. It's actually the backup of your data. Now you hear me talk about this on the channel and on Instagram posts quite a lot about backing up your data so you don't lose your data. But it's also from a different point of view. Now you mentioned in the first part, and I mentioned in the first part about having evidence. If you back up your data, you then have evidence for life. But you also have a foundation or a reservoir of data that you can dip in whenever you want to, long after your PhD, for protocols, for how you did something, or looking back. So you have that for life, and then you don't lose it. Now, if you were not to back up your data, and you went to somebody and said, I've done this work, and you've lost it, or you got corrupted, whatever, it's not just that you've lost your data. You've now lost that evidence, and more importantly, that time that you dedicated is now gone. It was wasted. Because you can't grab it back. So all that investment, all that money, all that time, all that perseverance is now gone. And you don't want to be in that position. And you can fail a PhD because your data can be corrupted and be like, did you do anything? Yeah, I did, but the data is corrupted. Now, nowadays, this becomes less and less of a problem. But sometimes that key experiment that sometimes changes the way your PhD is or forms that next paper is lost perhaps because of corruption in terms of the data and everything else. So if it's not backed up properly, you can do all the experiments, all the raw data, and then that final one that it worked, we don't have evidence. How can people trust you? How can people think that, okay, you actually did that work? So that organization comes in, and that can be how you plan your experiments. You could, and I've seen this, people have done experiments, and got to the end, and they made a colossal error on one buffer solution, on one very important equation. They had to redo the entire work based on one single error because they didn't include something throughout the entire experiment. I think it was a particular control in regards to their work. So imagine lack of organization can go to the point where you end up in the viva and like, oh, hold on, did you not do this? And then that's actually something that can get a major correction or rejection. And sometimes, because remember, your supervisors can look at something, but they can overlook, they can miss something. So if there's a lack of organization, it's going to make it a lot more difficult to identify errors. And that's what I'm trying to get at with this whole lack of organization, not backing up data, not having it very nice and transparent. It makes it a lot harder to pick out where errors can be. And if it's harder to do that, the further you get along, the less you're actually screening out problems. And then sometimes those problems can arise when an external examiner looks at it during a viva. And you don't want to be in that position for sure. So organize. There's Notion, there's Apple Notes, there's actual handbooks, there's notebooks, there's all sorts that you can use out there. I can't even imagine how many applications or softwares. There's Microsoft OneNote, I use Apple Notes a lot now. You can organize your data. And in regards to cloud storage, you probably know more than I do in terms of Google Drive, OneDrive. There's your own. You can even make your own cloud storage. There's hard drives you can back it up to. You can back it up with this on your computer if you want to. But I will definitely go with cloud storage to make sure you have evidence. And this is what I'm trying to get at. Failing your PhD can be due to poor experiments, which is not the case. But sometimes you can make a big error and you don't have evidence to support that it was an error, and then you don't want to be in that position. I didn't want to be in that position, which is why I'm trying to make this video for you all, and I don't want you to be in that position. But let's move on to number 3. Number 3 by far is the most plausible reason for failing a PhD. Now the other two are important, but I don't see that happening quite often around the world. But it's important to remember, this is very, very important, because you can have tons of failed data and still get a PhD. You can have tons of very, very similar data and still get a PhD. You can have very minimal data and still get a PhD. But you can also have 3 cracking results chapters that are very amazing on their own right. But if there's not a flow, they're not connected, you can still fail your PhD. What I'm trying to get is, if there's not a cohesive flow and connection between your research, between your experiments, you can fail your PhD. Now, the story and flow, I cannot express how important it is for a PhD for you to get accepted and get your doctorate. If it's hazy and it's confusing and it's difficult to read for an examiner, it's very hard pressed then for them to accept it, because they will spend hours and hours in your viva trying to figure out how is this connected. And if it's not, then it's going to lead to a potential major rejection. If it's easy to read, if it's easy to understand, if there's a connection between, it makes life a lot easier for you to get accepted and get your doctorate as a PhD. But a lack of story, a lack of flow can be monumental and can be quite disastrous in terms of whether you get a major correction or a minor correction, until the point where you actually fail your PhD. Now, you can mention the obvious about making sure your supervisors are there. All of these are quite common, but I don't think a lot of people appreciate how important flow is in terms of your research, and how flow and your story are important for your papers and also important for your annual reviews and for your thesis. Believe me, if your research does not seem very easy in terms of connections, it's not easy to follow, how do you expect an examiner to follow it? Because they'll ask more questions about what is missing than why did you do this, how do you see me talk about why and how quite a lot. They won't be talking about why and how, they'll be talking about doesn't make sense. What's the point of this? I don't understand the connections here. Why do you do this and that? So they'll be talking more about understanding the data in the wrong way, as opposed to enjoying the data and understanding, the great results that you've got, and did you do this experiment or that? And you don't want to be in that position, because from what I've seen as well with the external examiners, the more they are confused, the worse it is for you. And that can be disastrous from the point of potentially failing your PhD. And I don't want you to be in that position, which is why I want to put this out there to make sure and emphasize, make sure your chapters and your stories are very succinct, there's a cohesive flow to it, and make sure that is in your experimental design. Because if you just started your PhD and you got that in the first year, it'll flow through your entire PhD and to your viva, where it becomes a nice, enjoyable discussion, because they can understand everything from start to finish, even backwards, left, right, center, you name it, all this way, that way. They can understand it in every different way possible. And you want your examiners to do that. So I hope that helps. I know this might have been a shorter video, but I hope you take on these points, because they're very influential for me in terms of making sure that I got through my viva a lot better than maybe the average person, because I looked at these points going in, I looked at these points from my second year and third year. And if you're first year, or even if you're finishing off, I do hope you find these videos useful, these points useful, and if you've got any advice or suggestions for future videos, let me know in the comment section down below. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, click that like button, it could be helpful for me and the algorithm and the YouTube channel and all of that. And I should hopefully see you in the next video. Hope your research is going well. I hope you're well. And I shall see you in the next one. Take care.